President Trump sat down for an interview with Chris Wallace of Fox News. Chris Wallace is one of the better Fox News hosts, which isn't saying much, admittedly. It's like being the tallest kid in kindergarten. But, when he puts his mind to it, he can ask some tough questions, and he can be aggressive. And there were many parts of this interview where he kind of just casually cornered Trump because he's significantly more intelligent than Donald Trump is. And what came from it was hilarious. So here's the part of the interview about masks.
You wore a mask for the first time in public at Walter Reed this weekend. Question, the CDC says if everybody wore a mask for 4 to 6 weeks, we could get this under control. Do you regret not wearing a mask in public from the start? And will you consider a national mandate that people need to wear masks?
No, I want people to have a certain freedom, and I don't believe in that, no. And I don't agree with the statement that if everybody wear a mask, everything disappears. Hey, Dr. Fauci said don't wear a mask. Our Surgeon General, terrific guy, said don't wear a mask. Everybody was saying don't wear a mask. Well, all of a sudden, everybody's got to wear a mask. And as you know, masks cause problems, too. With that being said, I'm a believer in masks. I think masks are good. But I leave it up to the governors. Many of the governors are changing. They're more mask into. They like the concept of masks. But some of them don't agree. I do say this. Schools have to open. Young people have to go to school. And there's problems when you don't go to school, too. And there's going to be a funding problem because we're not going to fund, when they don't open their schools, we're not going to fund them. We're not going to give them money if they're not going to school.
Every part of that was absurd, so let's walk through it. First of all, he says he's not in favor of a national mandate for masks because freedom. But if you really take that to its logical conclusion, then if states mandate masks, then it's states restricting freedom, which in theory should be just as tyrannical as the federal government restricting freedom. If you say, hey, the federal government mandating masks is tyranny, well, then the state governments mandating it as well would be tyranny. It would just be tyranny from the states instead of the federal government. But he's not willing to take that to its logical conclusion because I think he knows deep down that it's absolutely ridiculous. That it's really not tyrannical. It's really not some absurd restriction on freedom, any more so than having seatbelts in cars is an egregious infringement on freedom. It's a very basic safety regulation in a very extreme time in history when there's a pandemic. So he's not even willing to use his flawed logic and take it to its conclusion. Because again, the conclusion would be if a mask mandate is against freedom, well, then it would also be against freedom if the states mandate it. So if he was really standing by that, he would say, no, I've also blocked the states from mandating masks, but he doesn't do that. So I think he knows deep down that that's absurd. Now, he actually says there, I don't agree that if you wear a mask, this disappears, talking about COVID-19. But he's famously said at least 2 other times, and I remember we talked about it on the show, that it's going to disappear one day. COVID is going to disappear one day. One time he said early on, as soon as the heat comes in April, along with the heat, it's supposed to just disappear. Many people say it's supposed to just disappear. He even said it more recently, and he wasn't talking about it in the context of the heat in the recent interview, but he said one day it's going to disappear. So let me get this straight. Without wearing masks, one day it's going to disappear, but if you do wear masks, he says that's not going to make it disappear. Okay, there's no doubt that wearing masks will make it disappear sooner. So again, why wouldn't you be in favor of it? Listen, guys, I had the opinion early on when it came to this pandemic that we needed to do basically the entire economic shutdown. We needed to press the pause button on the entire economy. Because, what the hell else were we supposed to do? There's a pandemic ripping through the country. But looking at all the evidence since then, we know a lot more now than we did early on. And looking at all the evidence, we definitely could have gotten away with just partial shutdowns of industries that are particularly in a bad situation like restaurants. You can't really eat inside and be close to people because you're going to spread the virus like crazy. So very specific economic shutdowns. But overall, you could keep most of the economy open. The only requirement we needed from early on to stop this thing in its tracks is universal masks. That's it. Now, why am I saying that? Because countries where they have virtual universal masks handle this pandemic swimmingly. I've given the example 1,000 times on the show, but Japan, basically everybody wears a mask there, less than 1,000 COVID deaths. Less than 1,000. So if you just had early on, it would have been amazing if Trump came out there wearing a mask from day one of this pandemic, selling Make America Great Again masks on his website. All the conservatives would have been like, yeah, masks are awesome. And then you would have had Democrats, as a general rule, tend to believe more in science, like climate change, evolution, things of that nature. So they'd be like, yeah, I agree, let's all wear masks. So then the whole country basically would have been wearing masks, or at least 8 out of 10 people, and we would have done really well with this stuff. But then the final point here is, and I think this is incredible, he brings up the argument for masks that like, well, just leave it up to the states. Let them decide. The big bad federal government is not going to interfere. But then he goes on to talk about schools opening, and he says, no, we want to make them open. You just said leave it up to the states for masks. Now you're saying, no, we're not going to leave it up to the states when it comes to schools. So you want to force schools open. You want the federal government to effectively make the decision by cutting funding. So you want to force schools open, which is the federal government putting pressure on the states. But you don't want to force states and force the country to wear masks at the federal level. So again, he just flips on the principle. The principle when it comes to masks is, I guess we'll default to states' rights. But he's not defaulting to states' rights when it comes to schools. He wants to force the schools open. That's the federal government forcing the states to do something. So there's no... Guys, I think this is one of the things about the Trump era that drives me crazy. It's not just that he's wrong about stuff, which he is, but there's no consistency. There's no, actual ideological commitments. He's just, everything about him and the decisions he makes is just totally impulsive and just totally based off of, what he thinks when he just watched a Fox News segment 6.5 minutes ago. Like, this is how he's making his decisions. And he ends up looking like a total idiot because he flips on principles left and right. He has no principles. And, there is no doubt that every step of the way, his decisions have been anti-science. There was a story that came out recently about how the Trump administration is redirecting the coronavirus data from going to the CDC to first coming to them. Why? Because they want to juice the data. Because basically Trump has given up on fighting this pandemic in any serious way. So now he wants to just play with the numbers to make himself look better and to make it look like the numbers aren't as bad as they are. I mean, this is comical stuff, man. This is Banana Republic stuff, what's going on here. So it's really amazing to me. Guys, the most important policy you could have in the middle of a pandemic is universal masks. And that's the last thing that they want to do. He's avoiding, as much as possible, doing something like that. But he is going to force schools to open. And listen, just so everybody understands, I'm not saying I have all the answers here. I don't. I have the humility to know that I don't have all the answers. But the idea that, opening schools is a no-brainer, and it's, because he goes on to say in the same clip, it doesn't affect children that bad, it doesn't affect children that bad, so what are we going to do? I think we should open the schools. What about the teachers, dipshit? What about that? What about that? What about the fact that these kids are like little petri dishes and, they live with older people, and then what's going to happen if they visit the grandparents on the weekend or something? What about that? There's no thought in what he's saying. Everything got immensely political, and partisan is actually the better word for it. And so, to the extent there is any consistency in his ideology, which there isn't, one of the defining characteristics is just owning the libs. I'll just say the opposite of whatever they're saying. Oh, they want to be careful and maybe not open schools or do something different because of the pandemic? Well, no, now I'm against that. See, he's trying to force everything back to normal. But you can't do it unless you control the virus. There will be no normal unless you control the virus. So you think you could force everything back to normal and pretend like everything's all hunky-dory? Well, this is why you're down massively in the election. He's down massively now. And we'll get to that story later. I'll give you the specific poll numbers. But see, Trump, his whole life, he'll just like override stuff with confidence and bravado and just plow forward. And everything is treated like a marketing problem. Well, in many ways that works politically, and that actually is a benefit to always be your strongest advocate. But there are some situations in which it's just not a marketing problem, and you can't override it through force of will. One of those things is a pandemic. The other thing is a giant economic downturn, a COVID depression, incredibly high unemployment, low wages, 32% of the country not being able to pay their rent or their mortgage. You can't just override that, but he's trying. And that's why he keeps slipping in the polls more and more. But this clip just makes me sad, because you would think that it's a very basic thing to want somebody to run the country who at least acknowledges and believes in the science. But we don't even have that. We have an idiot who trusts his gut and impulse over actual science and doctors. And it's just disgusting to see, and the results are quite literally deadly.